Today we're talking about something that we practice on a daily basis, but few seemingly ever master it. So stay with us and we'll be back in 30 seconds with our program today.
How do you explain? How do you describe?
In Him, all families are blessed. Join our discussion on Fabric of Family.
Communication is the lifeline that holds our relationships together. But despite the many words we speak in a day, too often we're very unskilled in the art of communicating. It's not that we don't have the ability to communicate clearly, but sometimes we just simply fail to listen. It's kind of like the story of the well-known Broadway producer Jed Harris, who once became convinced that he was losing his hearing. And so he visited a specialist. The specialist pulled out a gold watch and asked him this question: "Mr. Harris, can you hear this watch ticking?" "Oh, of course," Harris replied. The specialist walked to the door and asked the same question. And Harris concentrated and he said, "Yes, I can hear it very clearly." Then the doctor walked into the next room and repeated the question a third time. A third time, Harris said he could hear the ticking very clearly. "Mr. Harris," the doctor concluded, "there's nothing wrong with your hearing. You see, you just don't listen." You know, sometimes we just don't listen, do we? The Apostle James wrote, "Wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath." James chapter 1 and verse 19. You know, we would all do well to take a personal inventory regarding our communication skills. And so in today's program, we want to examine the Communication Lifeline. Time for our discussion panel, and I have with me two men who are going to help us in our discussion of our subject today. I'm going to give them the opportunity to tell us a little bit about them, but have Lonnie Jones with me as well as Rusty Hills. We'll begin with Lonnie. Lonnie, tell us a little bit about you for those who may not know you.
I'm a licensed professional counselor. Came out of a long history of youth and family ministry. Probably have 30 plus years under my belt. In 1998, I went into private practice and have a very small practice there in Huntsville, Alabama. Do some adventure-based therapy, and I'm also the family minister for the Maysville Church of Christ.
It's good to have you with us, Lonnie.
Thank you very much.
And we also have Rusty Hills. Rusty, tell us a little bit about you.
All right. I am the pulpit minister for the Chase Park Church of Christ, also in Huntsville. I have been in ministry for about 15 years, a couple of different locations, and have been preaching all that time. Received my education from Free Hardeman University, and glad to be here.
It's good to have both of you with us. We're talking about a very, very important subject today. We're dealing with the subject of communication and how communication is a lifeline. I suppose I want to throw this out initially just to kind of see what your thoughts are concerning this topic, but why would you say that communication is so important in relationships?
Well, I would say without communication, it's difficult to have a relationship. A relationship, almost by definition, is the sharing of life with one another in some respect, and without sharing thoughts and feelings and words and those types that type of interaction, it's hard to have a relationship at all.
What about you, Lonnie?
When you think about communication, the Greek word for fellowship, koinonia, that's both the giving and receiving of not just information but things. One of the famous therapists on the West Coast, John Gottman, talks about when you build a house, You start with these lower levels, but the ultimate meaning is, the ultimate level of that house is shared meaning. And without communication, you don't have any shared meanings. If two should become one, who should the one become? You don't know those parameters until you communicate with each other, knowing your shared dreams, your shared values, your shared goals.
Well, do you think that people are generally good communicators?
I do not.
Okay. Why do you think that we're not good communicators? I mean, we do it every day, don't we?
Well, we think we do. My answer comes from therapy sessions, and that it seems to me that when people have trouble communicating, it's because I'm trying to make you understand me rather than really trying to understand you. And if you ever swap that the most important part of communication is seeking understanding rather than giving you understanding, you don't communicate well. It becomes a competition, not a cooperation.
I think we're often better at talking than we are communicating, and those two are not necessarily the same thing. We're often not very good listeners as far as understanding what's being said to me and understanding the meaning behind what's being said. We don't listen very well sometimes, and again, we talk, but sometimes our intent is not to be understood. Our intent is to be just to be heard, maybe, and somewhere in there, communication is lost.
I think that's a very valid point. I know that I, in my ministry and also in counseling that I've done, when you're talking with maybe a couple, both individuals want to be heard, but it seems like so many times the problem is that though they want to be heard, they don't do a good job listening in the process. Has that been your experience?
Look at the dynamic that takes place. Here's the husband, here's the wife, and he says, understand me. And she goes, no, understand me. And no, understand me. No, understand me. That's a competition.
Yeah.
But when he stops and says, let me make sure I understand you, all of a sudden she feels valuable, she feels special, she feels listened to, and she's more inclined then not to defend her position, but to try to understand his position. And then you get that actual sharing that the word communication actually means.
Or do you think that we just resist good communication, or is it just something we kind of fall into as far as having bad communication?
I don't know that most of us, I don't know that we actively resist good communication. Maybe we think we are communicating, and I think a lot of times we do. As we sit down with our spouse or with our children or with anyone else, we think we're communicating, we're talking, and so we don't understand why she's not understanding me or I'm not understanding her, and we just kind of fall into those habits of bad communication. A lot of times we want to lay blame, and we want to say you need to do this and you need to do that, and instead of saying I want this and I want to understand you in this way, and so we just kind of fall into those bad habits, I think, most of the time.
I think by default, when we talk about communication as ministers and therapists, we superimpose that into a category of conflict resolution, because we've already talked about dealing with cross purposes. And real communication occurs outside the context of conflict. It's understanding your needs, understanding what's special to you, understanding that this is something that you wish for. And when those things are unmet, that creates conflict. And so it seems like when we talk about communication, it always has the default setting of, hey, how do you deal with conflict? When really you avoid the conflict if you communicated better before the conflict. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's think about this for a moment, because this is so important. When we talk about having good communication with our spouse or with our children, what are some of the basic components that we need to be aware of and we need to think about if we want to be good communicators?
Well, I'd already mentioned, I think one of the things that we often overlook is listening, real engaged listening to conversations. We get caught up in talking sometimes too much and not enough in listening. So I think that's one of the variables that exist there that we need to grab onto and do better at.
It starts with body language. You make eye contact, you put down your paper, you put down the remote, you quit texting on your phone, you put the iPad away, and you give them your full attention. That's kind of stereotypical. If I'm watching TV, I'm watching TV. I don't watch TV and talk. Now, my wife can multitask, but I don't. I'm either watching TV or I'm talking, but I don't do both. So you invest into it first. And the second thing you do, they used to talk about reflective listening and paraphrasing and all that.
Yeah.
What it boils down to is me demonstrating that I've understood what you've said. So let me get this straight. What you'd like to do for vacation is just stay home rather than go somewhere because we're so busy. Oh, yes. Well, if I make that statement, she says, no, that's not what I said.
Gives the opportunity to go back and to clarify.
Right.
And to repeat. Yeah. Okay. So, we've talked about the importance of listening. We've talked about the importance of, giving our full attention, clarification. Rusty, you want to add something to that?
Well, I was just going to say, I think another thing that we don't often attach this verse maybe to the topic of communication, but Matthew 7:12, when Jesus says, "What you want men to do to you, do also to them." The golden rule. Yeah. If we want to be listened to, if we want to be treated with respect and kindness, then it's our duty to give those things to the person we're communicating with. Give them the kindness, the respect, listen to them, and I think that goes a long way to helping our communication to be effective.
And along with that, the ratio is 5-to-1, positive to negative, in all aspects of relationships, parents to children and spouses to spouses.
Explain that.
Okay, let's look at the book of Ephesians. Let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but only what is good for necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearer. When we talk about things, I can positively state what my needs are, or I can negatively state them.
Okay.
It's a complaint versus a criticism. During deer season, my wife may say, "You're never home." Or she could say, "I wish we spent more time together." One of those has honey in it, one of those had rattlesnake venom in it. And so when you're talking in general, think about, does my life have more positive or more negative when I'm talking to the people in my family?
And sometimes it's kind of hard for us to be unbiased, isn't it?
I think it's just easier to talk about what's not working than to focus on what is working. You can talk about celebrations or regrets. You can talk about accomplishments or disappointments. And it seems to me that we like to talk about those things, or it's easier to talk about those things than it is to tell somebody, "Hey, I appreciate what you did do," rather than pointing out what you didn't do.
Well, we think about the Bible for just a moment, and how that the Bible has been given to us by God to be a manual for us. And so many times we think about the Bible as being a source to know about God and to know about salvation, to know about His church. But is the Bible a good manual to teach us how to communicate more effectively?
Oh, absolutely.
How so?
Philippians 2:3, "Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in lowliness of mind let each of you esteem others better than himself." If I take just those concepts, the do's and the don'ts in that verse, into a communication, then my communication doesn't have a selfish agenda. It doesn't have me as some elevated authority or somebody who's got an inflated ego. And then I'm thinking about not my needs, but your needs.
That's an excellent thought, and we're going to be back in just a moment to continue our discussion.
Hey, hallelujah. Hey, praise God Jehovah. Amen. Amen. Amen.
Being a minister, I've done a lot of wedding ceremonies, and always the ceremonies are a little different, but at the same time, a lot of them have a lot of the same message. And usually we'll go something like this. Do you take him or her to be your lawful husband or wife, to live together after the laws of God in the holiest state of marriage, to love, honor, cherish, enjoy and in sorrow, in sickness and in health, in adversity or in prosperity, and be faithful to them until death do you part? And that's always a wonderful vow, and it's always a wonderful time for us to think about what we're really doing. Of course, we need to think about it beforehand, but at that time we need to understand that that is permanent in nature. But when I do that vow, before I finish that ceremony, I say those are the formal vows. Those are the vows that you make to each other that are to last a lifetime. But let me tell you what will make that lifetime be happier than you ever imagined. If I had a little imaginary box, I say, I will take this and give it to you. And there's some things in there that I want you to take out and use, and I want you to use them generously, and I want you to use them often, and here they are. Number one, make your relationship top priority. We live in a very busy world where there are things that will draw our attention every day. There will be things that will come up that are good things, but sometimes you have to say no even to good things so that you can say yes to better things. And you need to keep your relationship top priority, meaning that if there are other things, even though they might be good, that might pull you in a different direction, you need to always make sure that you do not neglect your own relationship. So keep that relationship always top priority in your life. Number 2, I tell them, don't ever stop dating. In other words, always keep that romance alive. Have a weekly date. Do things together that you can only do as a couple that will keep that relationship going and make it strong. I tell folks that, the very things that you have done for one another to win the love of one another, even before you got married, are the very same things you must continue to do if you want that relationship to thrive. So if you will always keep the romance going and keep that relationship alive, I guarantee you, you'll never regret it. Number 3, always make sure that you keep God in everything you do. Don't ever leave God out. Remember, it was God who created marriage, and it's still in His Word that we find the greatest marriage manual that has ever been penned. I find myself there on a regular basis trying to find what I need to be as a husband, what I need to be as a father, and now even as a grandfather. The very principles that are there that will help us to live a family life that will always bring glory to God. You see, the family has always been for man's good, but always for God's glory. It was God who created man. It was God who created marriage. And if we want to find out the best way that marriage works, we always need to go to His Word so that we can find out the best way that we can live it. And then also have another ingredient in that little box. I tell these folks, not only do we know that God created marriage, but we need to use the principles of His Word in our marriages every day. Think about this. If marriages would just take one thing like the Golden Rule and apply it in their situation, isn't it amazing what a difference it would make in our marriages? If we would just treat the other as we desire to be treated, if we would just use these kind of principles every day in every situation, wouldn't it make a difference in our marriages? Wouldn't it make a difference in our world? You see, God's ways are not outdated. In fact, they're just as appropriate, they're just as necessary in our day and time as they ever have been. And so if we will take those things and use them wisely, our marriages will be great. But this is not just for newlyweds. This is also for those of us that have been married however long in our lives. We must continue to take these principles and use them wisely in our lives. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Stan Dean, minister of the Killen Church of Christ, and this has been A Word for the Family.
We're back for our second part of our discussion, and we have with us Lonnie Jones and Rusty Hills, and we have been talking about communication and how to be more effective in communicating with one another. And I want us to go back to the thought of the Bible, and we were talking about how the Bible is such a good manual for communication before we broke just a moment ago. But I wonder, are there some specific verses maybe that are special to you that emphasize communication that you'd like to share?
I think the passage in James chapter 3 about the tongue is vitally important in understanding the power that rests in the language you use, in the words that you communicate with. And there is so much good that we can do through our communication. So we can be encouraging, we can be uplifting, we can be edifying, we can share love and all those things. But James says also, you need to be warned that the tongue can be deadly. It can be
very powerful, isn't it?
Very powerful, yeah. Full of deadly poison, as he says. And so be careful. That old saying that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me isn't true. Yeah. And words can be very harmful, and we need to be aware of that.
That's an excellent passage. Lonnie, any come to your mind?
I like Colossians 4:6, let your speech always be with grace.
Oh, yeah.
Seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer one another. And then back to the positive to negative ratio, Philippians 4 says the things that are lovely and good and pure and noble and just and of good report. If there's any virtue, anything praiseworthy, think on these things. When you start to talk to somebody, run that list in your mind and say, okay, is this something that they need to hear? And then if I do have to say something negative, then it's for necessary edification. And that's really, really important. And I don't want to get a debate started, but words only have the power you give them.
Okay.
If I take your words and I believe them, they're powerful. You know, Romans 1:16 says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, it's God's power. Well, if it's that powerful, how come everybody's not a Christian? Well, it only has the power that I give it. Even God's word is limited by how much stock I put in it. So if somebody gives you a negative report or somebody says something bad to you, you can camp out on it, or you can test it with, this is what I feel, this is what I know, and not getting caught up in emotion. And so many times we get into bad communication patterns because we let our emotions dictate the direction rather than our emotions just give us information.
Well, truly, there have been many great communicators down through the ages, even during our generation. But when we think about the Bible and we think about great communicators, I'm wondering who comes to mind.
I like Abigail.
Oh,
And that's
kind of an
it's an
odd,
obscure story.
Yeah.
She's married to this guy, and David sends his young men in and says, hey, can we share in your feast? And he insults David. He's insolent. He's rude. These young men go back to David and say, look, this guy treated us like dogs. And David says, well, put your swords on. And we'll go into town, and everybody who's a male is dead. You got David and 400 warriors riding into this town. What force could stop David? A female with a speech. And you read that speech Abigail gives. She'll even say, I hope the king's enemies are flung away from him like a stone from the pocket of a sling. Now, you don't think she used that example on purpose? Her grace and her poise, her submissiveness, and her demeanor take a king, a warrior king, bent on absolute annihilation, and saves the lives of everybody in that village.
Wow, what a wonderful example. I had not thought about Abigail. Rusty, what about you?
The person I was thinking of is much more obvious than Abigail, I guess. But when I read the writings of the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, and I think as he writes, there are two things that Paul understands very well about communication as he writes, maybe more than two, but at least these two. One is he truly, sincerely cares about the people he's writing to. Even if he's having to chastise them or rebuke them for something or try to correct some wrong, he is truly concerned with them and cares for them. And even in the midst of those rebukes, there's often in the Galatian letter, he says right in the middle of this rebuke, I have confidence in you. And so there is always that. And then Paul understands how his words are going to be taken. And, he typically begins his letters with positives, with encouragement, often with a prayer that he words for the people he's writing to. And so he builds them up and encourages them. And then if there are rebukes to be made, if there are things to be taught that are a little harder, he deals with those. And so he understands kind of the psychology of communication and how to build up his audience and get them on his side before he has to deal with negatives. And I think that makes his letters very effective. And
Two great communicators, the Apostle Paul and Abigail. As we think about communication, though, would you agree or disagree that we're better communicators with those that we don't know than we are with our own nuclear family? What do you think?
I think we're nicer to strangers than we are to people that are very, very close to us. But I think my wife understands me better than anybody on the planet, and I understand her better than anybody else does. So it's kind of I would walk a tightrope on that answer.
Yeah, and I like your answer, how that we're nicer to those who are strangers than sometimes we are to our own family. Rusty?
I think we often put more effort into communication with other people outside
Why do you
our
think
family.
that's the case?
I don't know. Maybe it has something to do with our spouses and I. We know each other so well. We're so comfortable with each other. Maybe we don't feel a need to communicate as much. Maybe we don't feel it necessary because of the relationship that we have and how well we know each other. Maybe we just feel like this person out here in the world, this coworker, this friend, whoever it is, they have the choice of whether or not to be in a relationship with us. Our spouse is kind of stuck. Where are they going to go? But that person has a choice, and so we have to engage them and put effort into that relationship in order to maintain it. Where maybe we don't feel that need, although it is there, we don't feel that need with our spouses.
And it can be good or bad. eat potato chips on the couch in my living room, I may not do it in your living room.
Yeah.
And it just may be that we just need to be more aware that we tend to let our guard down and be extra careful around our family, because it is easy to just get comfortable.
Sure.
Well, you know, as we think about our family and the communication that takes place, one relationship that certainly we need to think about is the parent-child relationship. And those who've been parents for any length of time knows that sometimes you think that you're communicating clearly to your child, but your child doesn't receive what you're saying, or vice versa. I'm just kind of curious as to what your thoughts are as regarding hindrances. Why sometimes are there issues that come up, especially in the parent-child relationship, as far as communication is concerned?
John Gottman's got a book talking about emotional intelligence, and it talks about the way we talk to kids. A lot of times we're uncomfortable with the emotionality of teenagers, and so we don't do emotion coaching. We're either emotion dismissing or we're emotion disapproving, and so instead of listening to our children, we lecture our children.
So we need to learn the importance of that interaction as opposed to just simply a lecture. That's a good point.
And the way a teenage brain is wired, they don't do logical processing. It takes them a long time to make a loop between what they feel and being able to articulate what they felt. And so where we get caught up in the emotion, those emotions for them are fleeting. And we need to slow down and let them process more than we should lecture and tell them why they shouldn't feel the way they're feeling.
Some excellent thoughts. Rusty?
Well, I think we sometimes go into those conversations with preconceived ideas. You know, the child thinks the parent's not going to understand, the parent thinks the child's not going to listen, and I think that flavors our communication sometimes.
Well, gentlemen, our time has quickly gone by, but I want to thank each and every one of you. Lonnie, I want to thank you. Rusty, thank you for being with us on our program today. And I can't help but think that what we've talked about today is going to be a blessing in someone's life.
Thank you.
Well, that's our program for this week, and we hope that you've enjoyed it. You know, God wants to communicate with mankind. And the way in which God speaks to us today is through His holy word. Are you listening? You know, at the Jackson Heights Church of Christ in Florence, Alabama, we would like to invite you to study the Bible in the privacy of your own home. We have a free Bible correspondence course that we would be happy to send you. Again, it's free. No one's going to call or visit you. We just want to help enrich your life by allowing you to see what plan the Lord has for you and your loved ones. So let us know if you would like to have a part in that study. And so for the Jackson Heights Church of Christ, Sane Video Productions, and the Gospel Broadcasting Network, I'm Barry Gilreath Jr., wishing you and your family a blessed week.